April 18, 1945. A brittle sun slivered through late winter clouds over the patchwork fields outside Augsburg, Germany. The air tasted faintly of damp iron and burned straw, smoke from a distant town hung low, a grey veil that made the world look as if it had been rubbed with pencil lead. The lane was a sunken thing, rutted with cart tracks and threaded with a hedgerow that still stubbornly held yellowing leaves. It smelled of horse sweat and oil, and every crunch underfoot sounded like a recorded step in a man's life, accounted for, counted, and catalogued. Staff Sergeant Thomas J. Keller of the 3rd Infantry Division moved at the front of the small patrol like a man who knew how to listen. He was 30, lean, with a face sunburned halfway through the European campaign and a jaw that had already learned the economy of trusting too few voices. His M1 Garand was slung but ready, his boots were caked in mud and the left heel had a tendency to slip. A map in his pocket was folded to a slippery square and had been marked with a pencil line by a lieutenant back at regimental headquarters: recon toward the airstrip, check for enemy movement, report back. Behind him came Corporal Eddie Ramos, 21, a farm boy from Ohio whose laugh had not yet been broken by the war but whose eyes had learned to measure silence. Private First Class Walt McBride carried the radio pack like he carried his own secret, bulky, important, humming slightly through his wool. 2 other men made up the patrol: Private Harold Jensen, a big-shouldered Minnesotan who smelled faintly of canned peaches, and Private Lucien Marchand, a quiet Louisiana Frenchman who kept stroking the brim of his helmet as if it were a rosary. They had been given an easy order: sweep the lane, scout the farmhouses, confirm the ruined airfield they'd heard rumors about. The intelligence was thin. Local peasants had muttered about aircraft beyond the hedgerow, about a new type that crawled like a shadow. Rumor in war is a dangerous currency, but the company needed confirmation. The senior leadership wanted eyes on the ground. The first half hour was ordinary: shuttered houses with curtains torn like sails, a horse tethered to a stump that watched them with a patient, dying interest, a child's doll face half buried in the mud like a pale moon. A German farmhouse, windows boarded, lay silent. A broken bicycle limped against a fence. Tracks led off toward the cut fields, tracks made not by boots but by heavier machinery. "Everybody keep your head down," Keller murmured. He listened for birds, for the whine of distant engines, for anything that did not belong. The lane turned and guided them to a shallow hollow where the hedgerow split and a broad, smoking scar opened into farmland. Beyond it, the ground flattened into a wide sweep that had once been an orchard, then an airstrip. Concrete strips lay in uneven, jagged ruins. One of the runways had been torn up, chunks of slab tipped up like scales. Burnt-out hangars crouched at the far end like shell-shocked beasts. They had expected an airfield, perhaps a few L-4 grasshoppers, maybe a Heinkel ground trainer or 2, the kinds of relics that the Luftwaffe sometimes kept tucked away. They had not expected to see anything that could not be accounted for by the textbooks Lieutenant Higgins had tried to teach them back in training. A shape broke the rim of the clay-covered field, the stub of a wing, burned black and so oddly pure in its geometry that for a half-second Keller thought it might be some experimental glider. He moved forward on instinct, the others behind him like a shadow formation. Up close, the ruin resolved into something almost surgical. Odd alloys gleamed where paint had been stripped away by flame, and the air around it carried that electrical smell that comes off hot metal when the world is changing faster than a man can keep up. Ramos swore softly. "Jesus, that's not like anything I seen." Keller crouched and ran a gloved hand along the edge of the wreck. The metal was warped but not thick in the way of bombers. It felt light, precise. The wing root showed rivets and panels stamped with odd characters and a number. Near the center, a small nameplate, half crumpled, scorched, still clung to the skin. He could just make out the letters, Jumo. The nameplate's letters seemed to pin the world to a new axis. He had read the name in intelligence briefings, Junkers Jumo 004. He had not expected to feel it, under his fingertips, on a broken field in Bavaria. The patrol spread out. What they found in the next half hour made a skeleton of what they understood the world to be. Two airframes lay like dead beasts, low-slung and sinister in the pale light. Their fuselages were shorter than the fighters Keller had seen, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, FW-190s, and the wings were blunt, broad, and inset with nacelles that had once housed engines. The engines themselves were half torn open, their interiors blackened, revealing strange turbines and thin blades like the spines of a strange insect. Where the canopy had been, glass lay in a spider's web across the dirt. Cockpits were opened, instruments melted into uselessness. Private Jensen found a wheel with a stamped serial and, against the manners of men who have never courts-martialed a curiosity, he whistled. The sound was small but human in the field of dead metal. "This ain't a fighter," McBride breathed, and there was no bravado in the sentence, only calculation. Marchand, who had a small pocket camera, a small, old Leica he had carried since North Africa, stayed a measure behind the others, his fingers already itchy to record what his eyes had found. He took 2 slow photographs, one of the whole ruined twin-engine silhouette, another of the nameplate that had been wedged beneath a charred wing rib. The camera made a small mechanical sigh and the click felt sacramental. Keller found the cockpit of the nearest machine and peered inside. The layout was unfamiliar, instruments clustered in an angular panel, a throttle quadrant that looked too small for the kind of brute strength used to fight piston engines, thick control columns and pedals, but their geometry hinted at lighter control inputs and faster response. Someone had scribbled on the panel with a grease pencil in hurried German, Trennung, separation. A folded Luftwaffe flight map, blackened at the edges, lay crumpled on the seat. The strap still smelled faintly of human sweat and gasoline. "Pilot?" Ramos called, voice thin. They found no bodies. No burned husks, no ruined helmets. There were, however, things that carried the imprint of modernity: fabric flight gloves with reinforced palms, a small oxygen regulator with tubing, and the ghost of fuel lines that attested to a propulsion system unlike anything in their memory. Where the engines had been, a small metallic stench rose: oil, burnt insulation, the pungent scent of catalysts and metal doing the work of angles they had not yet been taught. The men's reactions were private and sudden, a small, animal recognition that history was not a fixed thing but a moving beast. For Jensen it was the feel of metal that had been milled to a different standard. For McBride it was the shape of the nacelles. For Ramos it was a cold thought of speed, of things that ran without propellers and without the familiar roar of radial engines. For Keller it was the nameplate, Jumo 004. He had glanced at posters for technical briefings in regimental HQ that mentioned jet propulsion, in the abstract, pipe dreams and diagrams, words that meant nothing until they were in his hands. Someone in the patrol, maybe Ramos, maybe Jensen, said the word out loud: jet. The word rolled over the field like a small stone dropped in a quiet pond. It made ripples in their memories, in their understanding. Jet. A thing of textbooks, of scientists in laboratories, of far-off laboratories in Berlin, yes, but also now, impossibly, here. Keller straightened and stepped back, scanning the horizon. The ruined hangars were quiet, but the air felt like a held breath. Somewhere beyond, a rooster crowed in an old German accent. A dog barked and died away. For all the war's noise around them, this felt like a private moment, a moment the size of a hinge. "Radio this back," the corporal said. Tell command." McBride moved to the radio pack, fingers efficient despite the tremor he wouldn't later admit. He keyed the microphone and began to transmit. The voice that answered, crisp from a central operations net, asked their position, asked for identification. Keller repeated the coordinates, trying to make his voice steady. He described the machines. The voice asked if there were survivors. Keller said no. The voice, somewhere behind a desk under fluorescent light, breathed a long, slow, almost audible intake. "Stay put," the voice said. "We're sending a technical team. Keep the area secure." Keller looked back at his men. He saw the different shapes guilt and awe could take on a man's face. These men had seen death stripped raw and senseless, they had known the ordinary human savagery of war. But this was not ordinary. This was a revelation of the future on a field of yesterday. It changed the scale of what they believed possible, it shortened the distance between then and what came next. Ramos found a cigarette butt and lit it with hands that were practiced in the ritual. He watched the smoke and for a moment, his jaw softened. "What do we call it?" he asked, half to himself. Keller considered. The names they had, fighter, interceptor, bomber, were all inadequate. This thing had a line that whispered of speed and of how the world would be moved on its hinges. It deserved a better tag, something that captured the flicker of its steel. "We call it what it is," Keller said. "Jet. We call it a jet." As the sun edged toward the horizon, the patrol began to establish a perimeter. They dragged lengths of fallen barbed wire into place and posted scouts up hedgerows and in ruined farmhouses to keep watch. Night in Bavaria could be a kind of hungry dark, the patrol could not risk an enemy unit slipping in and taking the pieces. They were ordered to hold and to wait. In the coming hours, as the light thinned and stars began to be pricked into the sky like pinholes, the men tended to their simple duties, checking weapons, sharing tinned food from a ration can, telling small stories that were meant to be talismans against fear. Yet even banal acts carried an undercurrent of the immense. They spoke less of hometowns tonight and more of the machines they had found. The talk shifted toward the technical in a way that would have seemed comic on any other night. Jensen tried to measure the span of the wing with his boots. Marchand, whose hands kept returning to his camera, described the sound the turbines might make if they were whole and running. They moved with a sudden scientist's curiosity that belied the field training instructors they had in Silhouette only a month before. Once, as if trying to tether the strangeness to something human, Keller took out a small leather-bound Bible he carried and set it on a stone beside him. He opened it to nothing in particular, and the verse that caught his eye was about new things and the making of a path. He did not read it aloud. The men needed no scripture to feel they stood on the edge of something new. The night deepened. Scouts rotated, the radio chirped once in a long while with routine updates from the company. At around 2 in the morning a distant rumble rolled across the plain, not the steady drone of a distant bomber but the irregular clatter of artillery that marked the collapse of a front. The technical team did not arrive before dawn, they were caught elsewhere. But at first light a new set of boots, technicians from the Army Air Forces, a young captain with a thin face and an earnest way of asking questions, threaded into the field. Captain Harold E. Whitcomb of the 9th Air Technical Service Unit introduced himself with the practiced authority of a man who had spent more time around diagrams and lab benches than in hedgerows. His wire-rimmed glasses were smeared with the mud of 1,000 airfields. He opened his field case like a surgeon, producing tools and notebooks and an authority that smelled of grease and paper. Where the infantry had treated the wreckage as a discovery, Whitcomb treated it as a specimen. He spoke German names with a detached curiosity that somehow did not become callous. He photographed, he measured, he fingered the remnants of turbines like a jeweler taking stock of gems. When he found the JUMO 004 nameplate, his face changed for the first time from professional observer to something closer to a human being seeing a plot point in a science fiction story come true. Keller watched him and felt the horizon in his own mind shift again. The officer explained, quietly, in clipped sentences to preserve the sanctity of the field report, that these were jet engines, axial flow turbojets that did not need propellers and could, in theory, give an airplane speeds far beyond piston-driven interceptors. Whitcomb's voice had the wary excitement of a man who had read about a new river and realized, with dislocated joy, that he was standing on its bank. "You know what this means?" McBride asked, though he had already heard the answer in Whitcomb's tone. Keller nodded slowly. He imagined the sky full of machines that did not sound like the piston roar they had been trained to dread. He imagined planes that climbed and accelerated without the familiar rotational howl. He imagined the world, cities, battles, strategy, measured differently. But the field was also suddenly an object lesson in the endgame of technology and war. The Me-262, for that is what the silhouette had been, had come too late, its promise stunted by fuel shortages, by organizational dysfunction, by a war that had burned through Germany's ability to think beyond itself. What lay in the mud before them were not triumphs but the tired, wasted artifacts of a nation that had pushed its science to the edge and found itself falling over after. Keller felt no gloating. The wind blew and scattered ashes across the fuselage. There was a solemnity in the ruin. These were the remains of pilots who had once trained, who had once climbed into cockpits and hoped to change the calculus of the sky. The future had arrived in pieces, here in a Bavarian field, and it carried with it both the brilliance of human invention and the small tragedy of its misuse. When Whitcomb finally looked up from his instruments and announced they would attempt to tag, catalogue, and retrieve as much as possible for analysis, Keller, Thomas J. Keller, felt the weight of their task. They were not just soldiers anymore but witnesses to a pivot in modern warfare. The Scouts' discovery had been a doorway. Beyond it were months, years, a reordering that none of them could yet define. "Keep the perimeter," Whitcomb said. "Report anything. And no souvenir hunting. We'll bring in transport." Keller answered, "Yes, sir," though his mind already roved, future skies, faster planes, and the strange, humming engines that had once lived and burned on a field that smelled of burned straw and iron. He would remember the exact bend in the lane, the way the morning light struck the charred fuselage, the jagged shadow across the concrete. He would store details the way men store currency against hard times, the grease pencil marks, the way the canopy had collapsed, the faint scorch that traced the outline of an emblem. And when he closed his eyes at night, after the technical teams had gone and the air had been cleared, he would see those engines as both a promise and a warning. Ahead of them lay the long work of understanding, for the Army, for the pilots, for the planners who would have to imagine airspace not as a place of propeller arcs and predictable climb but as a domain of instantaneous acceleration and short, brutal strikes. For men like Keller and his patrol, the discovery would be a story to tell in later years, one told with an odd mixture of awe and fatigue, the day an American scout found German jet wreckage and, with the taste of burned metal in his mouth, realized that the future had already arrived. The next morning came with a thin drizzle that polished the wreckage into a dull mirror. The Bavarian airfield at Augsburg was no longer a secret. Trucks rumbled in before dawn, olive-drab silhouettes against the paling horizon, carrying engineers, photographers, and an escort detachment from the 12th Army Group. The infantry patrol that had found the Me-262s were now spectators to something larger, the official unveiling of a technology no one fully understood. Staff Sergeant Keller stood on the tarmac's broken edge, helmet tilted back, cigarette cupped in his hand. He watched the technical men step carefully through the debris field, white lab coats over their uniforms, tape measures dangling from their belts. They looked less like soldiers and more like undertakers for the modern age, men cataloging the remains of a creature that had been alive only days before. Captain Whitcomb was back, clipboard in hand, barking to his team in the sharp, clipped rhythm of scientific excitement. "Mark every identifiable component, turbine blades, compressor rings, fuel manifold, anything still intact. I want serials recorded before the light goes." One of his assistants, a wiry lieutenant with a Boston accent, crouched beside an engine nacelle that had been ripped clean from its pylon. He scraped away the soot with a rag, revealing curved blades arrayed like the petals of some mechanical flower. His pencil moved rapidly across the notebook. "Looks like 14 stages," he muttered. "Axial compression, not centrifugal." Whitcomb's head snapped up. "Axial? Are you sure?" The lieutenant nodded, tapping the housing. "She's not spinning air like a radial pump. This thing's drawing it straight through. Continuous thrust line." Whitcomb let out a low whistle. "Good God." The words hung in the damp air like a verdict. The soldiers nearby didn't understand the mechanics, but they felt the weight in Whitcomb's tone. Something about the way he said, "Good God," made it sound like discovery and fear were the same emotion. Down the airfield, Keller and his men took a slow circuit past the hangars. They had been strafed, their roofs caved in, walls punched through by artillery. Inside one, the skeletal frame of another jet sat on trestles, half completed, half destroyed. Welding torches, rusted and cold, lay on the floor. Chalk marks covered the concrete walls, numbers, equations, and what looked like airflow diagrams. Ramos pointed at one scribbled formula and shook his head. "You think they were building more of these?" Keller nodded. "Looks that way." In one corner of the hangar, they found a row of long, slender fuel tanks and a notice board littered with German-language schematics. One blueprint showed the sleek outline of the Me-262, annotated with arrows, thrust calculations, and speed figures that made Ramos' eyebrows climb. 700 kilometers per hour, he read aloud. "That's over 400 miles an hour." Jensen gave a low whistle. "That's faster than any fighter we got." "Faster than anything anybody's got," Keller replied. He walked slowly past the drawing and paused before a workbench. Scattered across it were small mechanical parts, injection valves, compressor blades, wiring looms. But what caught his attention was something deeply human, a Luftwaffe pilot's logbook, scorched along its edges but still legible. He opened it carefully, the paper crinkling under his gloves. The first page bore a name in neat script, Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer. Beneath it were flight entries, not training, not theory, but actual sorties. Dates, March 31, April 5, April 12. Aircraft designation, Me-262A-1A. Mission type, intercept. Remarks, contact with B-17 formation over Munich. 2 confirmed. 1 damaged. Heavy flak, engine flameout, returned base. Keller stared at the words, engine flameout. It was a small, technical failure recorded without emotion, but it spoke volumes. The jet, for all its terrifying speed, was fragile. The Germans had harnessed the future but hadn't yet learned to keep it caged. By mid-morning, Whitcomb's team had pried open one of the intact turbines and spread its guts across a canvas tarp. The rain had stopped, and sunlight glinted on the polished edges of nickel alloy blades. A small crowd had gathered, engineers, infantry, even a few curious officers. The air was filled with the metallic tang of oil and the quiet hum of understanding spreading through the group. "This engine alone," Whitcomb said, addressing them, "is decades ahead of anything in Allied service. Look here, axial compressor, annular combustion chamber, twin-stage turbine. This thing burns kerosene instead of high-octane avgas. It could outrun a Mustang before you even throttle up." A captain from the 8th Air Force frowned. "Then why didn't they win the skies?" Whitcomb's eyes flicked toward the wreckage. "Because genius doesn't replace fuel, training, or time. These engines burn out after 20 hours. Materials can't take the heat. They've built the future, but they couldn't sustain it." The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. The infantrymen glanced at each other. They were used to tangible enemies, not ideas wrapped in metal and math. Yet even they understood that this wreckage wasn't just a broken plane. It was evidence that the war they'd been fighting was already obsolete. At noon, a low droning approached from the west, not the menacing buzz of Luftwaffe aircraft, but the steady beat of C-47 transports. The Army Air Forces were moving in. The first plane dropped its gear and settled awkwardly on the uneven strip, engine spitting dust. Out stepped a cluster of officers and civilian scientists in long coats, men who had arrived from London, Paris, and Washington to collect what the Germans had left behind. Whitcomb saluted stiffly. "Welcome to Augsburg, gentlemen. You're just in time to meet the future." Among the newcomers was Dr. William von Karman, the Hungarian-American aerodynamicist who had been advising the U.S. Army Air Forces on experimental propulsion. He adjusted his spectacles and looked at the Me-262 carcass like a man appraising a new species. His voice was soft but sure. "They built it too soon," he said. "But soon, everyone will build them. He turned to Whitcomb. "You'll need to ship this entire site to America. Every engine, every drawing, every screw. Don't let anything fall into Soviet hands." Whitcomb nodded grimly. "Yes, sir. Operation Lusty is already underway." The term, Lusty, made Keller frown. "What's that mean?" he asked Ramos. Ramos shrugged. "Probably some code name for scooping up all this stuff." He was right. Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe secret technology, was the Allied mission to seize and study every advanced German aircraft. Within weeks, the remnants of Augsburg would be packed, crated, and shipped across the Atlantic. The wreckage Keller's patrol had stumbled upon would become the foundation of post-war aviation. As the afternoon wore on, the soldiers helped load debris onto trucks. Keller found himself beside Dr. von Karman, who watched each piece vanish into the trucks with the patience of a man watching seeds being sown. "You know," the doctor said quietly, "when your bombers crossed the Rhine, this war was already lost for Germany. But when you found these jets, the next war began." Keller didn't answer. He wasn't sure what the man meant, the next war. He only knew that the sight of those burned engines had made him uneasy. They didn't look like victory. They looked like prophecy. As the convoy began to roll out, Keller climbed into the back of a jeep, the wind tugging at his collar. The field behind them receded, a graveyard of twisted metal and lost dreams. The clouds were breaking, and sunlight glanced off the remains of one engine, gleaming briefly like the edge of a blade. Ramos looked back too. "You think we'll ever fly in things like that?" Keller exhaled smoke, eyes on the horizon. "Yeah," he said quietly. "And when we do, God help whoever's underneath." The jeep bounced over the dirt road and joined the line of departing vehicles. Behind them, the last of the Me-262s lay silent, its turbines cold, its shadow stretching east toward the dawn of an era that would be written not in propeller wash, but in the roar of jet thrust. The war was almost over, but the sky had just begun to change. May 8, 1945. Berlin had fallen. Across Europe, German garrisons were surrendering one by one, and the Allied armies were sweeping up the detritus of a regime that had collapsed under its own monstrous ambition. But amid the ruins, a new kind of war was already taking shape, one fought not with rifles and tanks, but with blueprints, turbines, and captured scientists. For the men who had stumbled upon the Me-262 wreckage near Augsburg, the memory was still fresh, the smell of scorched fuel, the whisper of something otherworldly in those cold steel engines. For the Allied command, it was no longer just a curiosity. It was a national priority. At a commandeered Luftwaffe airfield near Lechfeld, not far from Keller's discovery, American transport aircraft now came and went in a steady rhythm. Wooden crates labeled property of U.S. Army Air Forces, Technical Service Command lined the hangar floors. Inside them were disassembled Me-262 fuselages, Jumo 004 engines, and fragments of radar systems. Pinned to one crate was a hand-lettered sign that read, "Operation Lusty, do not delay." The mission, short for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, had been born in the same week the war ended. It was the brainchild of intelligence officer Colonel Harold Watson, a man with a sharp nose for innovation and a sharper instinct for competition. His orders were clear: locate, secure, and ship every advanced German aircraft and document that could still be found. And do it before the Soviets. "Gentlemen," Watson told his gathered team at Lechfeld one gray morning, "the future's up for grabs. Whoever gets these jets first, owns the next war." His Watson's Whizzers, as they were soon called, were a motley collection of test pilots, engineers, and field officers. They wore flight suits stained with oil and carried clipboards instead of rifles. Their weapons were notebooks, cameras, and the occasional sidearm, for just in case the surrendering Luftwaffe decided not to play along. Keller and his patrol had been reassigned to help provide security for the recovery operation. It wasn't glamorous work, cordoning off sites, watching over captured hangars, escorting engineers, but it gave them a front-row seat to the strangest chapter of the war's aftermath. In one hangar, they watched as technicians rolled out a partially intact Mi-262. Its aluminum skin still bore the faint green and gray camouflage, its Luftwaffe crosses half-scorched away. A former German mechanic, now in American custody, stood nearby under guard. His name was Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, a young man with oil-streaked fingers and hollow eyes. Captain Whitcomb questioned him through an interpreter. "You maintained these aircraft?" Richter nodded. "Ja. Jetflugzeug, jet planes. Where were they built?" "Regensburg. Some at Lithium. Some underground." Whitcomb leaned in. "How many were operational by the end?" The German hesitated, as though weighing how much the world already knew. "Maybe 100. But no fuel. No pilots left. Too late." His voice cracked a little at that last phrase. Zoo spat. Too late. The three words seemed to sum up an empire's downfall. In another hangar, Keller watched as American engineers drained the remaining fuel from a captured Mi-262 and prepped it for flight testing. The idea that they would actually fly one of these alien-looking machines seemed absurd, until he saw it happen. On May 21, 1945, under a pale Bavarian sky, test pilot Lieutenant Roy Brown of the U.S. Army Air Forces taxied an intact Mi-262 across the cracked airstrip. The engines howled with an eerie, rising scream, unlike any propeller aircraft Keller had ever heard. The air shimmered behind the exhaust like heat bending the world. Then, with a rush and a roar, the jet lifted off. It didn't climb, it leapt. Straight, clean, almost contemptuous of gravity. Ramos let out a low whistle. Holy hell! Keller could only nod. The Mi-262 arced over the airfield, engine streaking pale smoke trails against the blue. It moved too fast for the eye to follow, vanishing and reappearing with uncanny speed. It was a glimpse of something beyond the war they knew, the kind of machine that belonged to another century. When the jet landed and taxied to a stop, Lieutenant Brown climbed out, his face pale with exhilaration. "Flies like a dream," he said breathlessly. "Touchy as hell on takeoff, but once she's airborne," he paused, still catching his breath. "Nothing on earth can touch it." For Whitcomb, that flight confirmed everything he had feared and hoped. The jet age was no longer a theory. It was here. And the world would never again fight the same kind of war. That night, under the dim bulbs of a requisitioned German farmhouse, Whitcomb drafted his official report for the Army Air Technical Service Command. Keller, who had been assigned as a runner, stood nearby while the captain dictated. Subject: Evaluation of Messerschmitt Mi-262 jet fighter aircraft. Findings: represents a complete revolution in air combat capability. Capable of outrunning all known Allied aircraft. Primary limitation: engine durability and fuel scarcity. Recommendation: immediate replication and testing within U.S. research programs. Secure all related personnel and materials for repatriation to the United States. Time is critical. He paused, set his pen down, and looked up at Keller. "You found the first one, Sergeant. You realize what that means?" Keller gave a faint, uneasy smile. "Means we found the future, sir." Whitcomb nodded. "And the trick now is making sure we control it." In the weeks that followed, train convoys rumbled west carrying the dismantled Mi-262s to the port of Cherbourg, where ships waited to haul them to America. Alongside the aircraft went tons of documents, blueprints, flight manuals, research logs, and a handful of captured German engineers, most of them eager to trade knowledge for safe passage. One name appeared repeatedly in Whitcomb's reports: Wernher von Braun, the man behind Germany's V-2 rocket program. Though he worked on missiles, not jets, his capture represented the same race, the struggle for control of science itself. The Americans would call it Operation Paperclip. The Soviets would call it theft. But everyone understood the truth: the Second World War had birthed the Cold War before the guns even cooled. On the last day before Keller's unit was rotated home, he stood once more beside the scarred airstrip where it had all begun. The field was empty now, the jets gone, the hangars stripped bare. Only a few scattered pieces of metal remained, glinting faintly in the afternoon sun. Ramos joined him, hands in his pockets. "You ever think about what comes next?" Keller squinted toward the horizon. "Yeah. Planes that can cross oceans in hours. Bombs that drop before you even hear them coming. Wars fought faster than we can understand." Ramos gave a small, dry laugh. "Guess we won't be needed much longer." "Maybe," Keller said softly. "Or maybe we'll just have to run faster." The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of oil and rain. The future was already humming, invisible but unstoppable, a sound like the Me-262's engines, distant yet rising. As the sun slipped below the Bavarian hills, Keller turned away from the empty runway, not realizing that what he had found, those burned wrecks half buried in the mud, would ignite a revolution that would define the next half-century. The jet age had begun. And mankind, once again, was racing to catch up with its own invention.